There's a housing estate in North London, just off the M25, tucked between the River Lee and the Lee Navigation, where you can walk down a street called Ordnance Road, turn onto Sten Close, and park your car on Bren Court. Most of the people who live there have no idea why those streets are named that way, no idea what was built on the ground beneath their homes, no idea that for 172 years, the island they live on was the most important weapons factory in the British Empire. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock is gone, almost all of it, where 48 buildings once sprawled across 90 acres of marshy ground, where machines stamped and milled and rifled barrels around the clock, where the rhythm of production never stopped. There are now 1,200 houses and flats, a small supermarket, a pharmacy, a Chinese takeaway, a primary school where children play on land that once shook with the recoil of test-fired rifles. We tell the stories of what was built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. One building survived, the machine shop, built between 1854 and 1858, Grade 2 listed, the oldest and largest structure on the site. Its Italianate facade still faces the canal basin, where barges once carried raw iron in and finished rifles out. Cast iron columns hold up the ceiling, red and yellow brick, weathered now, the mortar softened by 170 English winters. Inside, there's a small interpretation center, deactivated weapons behind glass, a few faded photographs of workers, a clock tower you can climb by ladder if you're fit enough, 55 business units, a gym, a community hall, and silence. That's what strikes you first, not the buildings or the canal or the neat rows of houses, the silence. For 172 years, this island was never quiet. The clang of machinery, the hiss of steam engines, the crack of proof firing on the range that stretched out toward the Royal Gunpowder Mills at Waltham Abbey. 3 shifts, 7 days a week, the rhythm of a factory that armed a nation through every war it fought from Waterloo to the Falklands. Walk along the Lee Navigation towpath now, and you'll hear cyclists, joggers, the dull hum of traffic on the M25 overhead. The water is still, ornamental, the same canal that once floated weapons to the Thames, 15 miles south, to be loaded onto ships bound for every corner of the empire. Down the road, there's a row of 81 cottages, Government Row, built in the 1850s to house the factory workers. Grade 2 listed, still occupied. In 1881, the residents included viewers, foremen, laborers, stokers, the pattern keeper, a gaslighter, and policemen. Now they're just homes. The people who live in them commute to offices. The Rifles pub, once the Royal Small Arms Tavern, compulsorily purchased by the government during the First World War so workers could drink between shifts, caught fire in 2004. It stands empty, gutted, a shell at the edge of a housing estate, the last building on the island that still looks like what this place used to be. So how does a factory that armed the British Empire for 172 years, that built the rifles carried at the Somme and at Normandy, and across the deserts of North Africa, end up as a housing estate? The easy answer is privatization, budget cuts, the long decline of British manufacturing. And those things are true, as far as they go, but they don't explain the real story, the darker one. The one about a rifle that was arguably the best assault rifle in the world in 1951, better than anything the Americans had, better than anything the Soviets had, and the political decision that killed it before it ever reached the soldiers it was built for. That story starts 200 years ago, on a marshy island at the edge of London, where the Board of Ordnance decided to solve a problem that had been costing British soldiers their lives. The problem was simple enough, and old enough to be embarrassing. At the turn of the 19th century, while Napoleon's armies were sweeping across Europe with mass-produced muskets, Britain was still building its weapons the way it had for centuries, one piece at a time, in dozens of small workshops scattered across the gun quarter of Birmingham. Individual craftsmen made individual components, barrels in one shop, locks in another, stocks in a third. The pieces were shipped to London and hand-assembled, each weapon slightly different from the last. Quality varied wildly, costs were high, and when demand surged, as it did during the Napoleonic Wars, the supply chain simply couldn't keep up. The Board of Ordnance, the government body responsible for arming Britain's forces, decided the answer was a factory, a single state-owned facility where weapons could be produced under one roof to a single standard, at scale. Their first attempt failed. In 1807, they established a royal manufactory of small arms in Lewisham, south of the Thames, powered by the River Ravensbourne. It was a reasonable idea with one fatal flaw. The Ravensbourne ran dry in summer. A steam engine was installed, but it cost more to run than the factory could justify. Within a few years, years, they were looking for a new site. They found it at Enfield Lock, marshland technically, a low-lying island formed by the River Lee on one side and the Lee navigation on the other, at the northeastern edge of what was then rural Middlesex. The land was acquired in 1812. Captain John By of the Royal Engineers, who would later go on to build the Rideau Canal in Canada, designed the waterworks. The site had what Lewisham didn't: reliable water power to drive the machinery, and a navigable canal to transport raw materials in and finished weapons out. By 1816, the factory was operational. Barrel making came first, transferred from Lewisham. Lock and finishing branches followed by 1818. The first superintendent, George Lovell, a tenacious man who'd spent years fighting to keep the project alive, oversaw a modest operation on difficult terrain. Damp ground, flooding, the kind of place that tested the patience of anyone trying to build something permanent. But Lovell built it, and it held. The first wholly Enfield-designed weapon was the Brunswick rifle, the British Army's first percussion lock firearm. Not revolutionary, but a start, a proof of concept. A government factory could produce weapons to a standard that the scattered workshops of Birmingham couldn't match. The factory nearly closed in 1831. Peacetime budgets are unforgiving, and a small arms factory without a war to supply is a hard thing to justify. But it survived. Modest, understaffed, quietly turning out rifles for an empire that didn't yet understand how much it would need them. Then came the Crimean War, and everything changed. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 did what 40 years of peacetime couldn't. It proved that Britain needed the Royal Small Arms Factory, and it needed the factory to be bigger, much bigger. Demand for rifles surged beyond anything the existing operation could handle. The Board of Ordnance looked across the Atlantic for a solution. American factories, Springfield Armory in particular, had pioneered a system of mass production using precision machine tools to make interchangeable parts. Individual components no longer needed to be hand-fitted. Any barrel could mate with any stock, any lock with any trigger assembly. The Americans called it the American System of Manufactures. The irony was thick. The principles behind it had originally been developed in Britain at Portsmouth Dockyard by Mark Brunel. The Americans simply applied them to firearms first. In 1856, the factory was rebuilt around this idea. A new machine shop, the same building that survives today, was constructed on American mass production lines. Machinery was purchased from the American firms Robbins and Lawrence and Ames Manufacturing Company at a cost of approximately £30,000. Sir John Anderson designed the layout. The Royal Engineers built it. James Henry Burton, an American who'd worked at the Harper's Ferry Armory, was brought in to install the equipment. The result was transformative. By 1860, 1,000 men were producing 1,744 rifles per week, roughly 90,000 per year. The machine shop was the largest of its kind in Europe. And in 1857, the Royal Small Arms Factory became the first factory in Britain to manufacture weapons with fully interchangeable parts using mass production techniques. The rifles they produced, the pattern 1853 Enfield, were so good that both sides bought them during the American Civil War. Northern and Southern agents competed to acquire them. An Enfield rifle was one of the most sought-after weapons on the planet. From there, the factory evolved with every advance in firearms technology. The Snyder Enfield breechloader in 1866, converting muzzle loaders to take metallic cartridges. The Martini Henry in 1871, the rifle that held Rorke's drift. The watermill gave way to steam power. 16 engines driving the works. The workforce swelled to 2,400 by 1887. In 1889, production began on a new rifle designed by James Paris Lee, an American working with the British. By 1895, that design had evolved into the Lee Enfield, the rifle that would define British infantry for the next 60 years. The rifle that went to the Somme, to Gallipoli, to the deserts of North Africa, to the jungles of Burma, the most famous bolt-action military rifle ever made. And around the factory, a community grew. It had to. The site was an island, isolated by water on every side, so the government built one. 81 cottages along Government Row for workers and their families, a school, a church, a police station with 3 sergeants and 9 constables, a fire brigade, 1 professional, 32 volunteers, the Royal Small Arms Tavern, where a man could drink after his shift, an apprenticeship program that became famous across the world. Young men trained in precision engineering, in metalwork, in the specific arts of making things that worked when lives depended on them. When the First World War broke out in 1914, there were roughly 1,800 workers at Enfield. By 1918, there were 9,500. Rifle production went from 1,000 a week to 6,500. Over the course of the war, the factory produced 2.2 million rifles. Women entered the workforce for the first time, nearly 1,500 of them by 1917, filling positions vacated by men who'd been sent to the trenches. Canteens were built that could seat 1,000 workers at a time. The pub was granted a 24-hour license because the factory ran 24 hours a day and there was no other canteen. The Second World War brought the Bren gun, designed with Czech input, produced at Enfield. The Sten gun, cheap, crude, effective, beloved by resistance fighters across occupied Europe. The Hispano cannon for aircraft. Production volumes that strained the site to its limits, requiring shadow factories at Fazakerley and Maltby to absorb the overflow. For 130 years, the Royal Small Arms Factory had done one thing supremely well. It had taken whatever the British Army needed and built it, at scale, under pressure, to a standard that soldiers could trust. The Lee Enfield alone was adopted by at least 46 nations. It wasn't glamorous work, it was essential work, the kind of work that wins wars and doesn't get mentioned in the speeches afterward. But after the Second World War, something shifted. The factory wasn't just asked to build weapons anymore, it was asked to design the future. And for a brief, brilliant moment, the men at Enfield and at the armament design establishment nearby did exactly that. They built the best assault rifle in the world, and then they were told to throw it away. The Second World War ended with a question that every army in the world was trying to answer. What comes next? The British infantry had fought the entire war with the Lee Enfield, a bolt-action rifle designed at the end of the 19th century, firing a .303 cartridge that dated from even earlier. It was accurate, reliable, beloved by the men who carried it, but it was obsolete. Every soldier who'd faced a German with a Sturmgewehr, the revolutionary STG-44, the world's first true assault rifle, understood that the future of infantry combat belonged to a different kind of weapon, lighter, shorter, capable of both semi-automatic and fully automatic fire, firing a smaller, intermediate-powered cartridge that a man could control without the weapon climbing away from his target. The Soviets understood this. They were already developing the AK-47. The Americans had the M1 Garand, semi-automatic, powerful, but heavy and limited by its 8-round clip. They knew they needed something new too, and the British quietly set about designing something that would leapfrog all of them. In 1945, the Army formed the Small Arms Caliber Panel, a committee of weapons experts tasked with developing a new standard cartridge for the post-war era. Military intelligence estimated it would be at least 10 years before the Soviet Union was ready for another major war. That meant time to research, time to test, time to get it right. The panel's reasoning was methodical. Combat data from the war showed that the vast majority of infantry engagements took place at ranges under 600 yards. The old .303 round had been designed to be effective at 1,000 yards and beyond, far more power and range than most soldiers would ever need. That excess came at a cost. Heavy ammunition, punishing recoil, rifles too powerful to be controllable on full automatic. The panel's conclusion was elegant: design a cartridge that matches the .303's performance at realistic combat distances, 600 yards, but with dramatically less recoil. After testing dozens of configurations, they settled on a .280 caliber round, 7 mm in diameter, weighing between 130 and 140 grains. It had roughly half the recoil of the .303. A soldier could fire it all day without fatigue, and on fully automatic the weapon would stay on target instead of climbing toward the sky. This was the .280 British, and it was, by nearly every technical measure, the right answer to the right question at the right time. Now they needed a rifle to fire it. At the armament design establishment, which had been relocated from RSAF Enfield to Cheshunt during the war, 4 teams went to work on competing designs, EM-1 through EM-4, experimental models. 2 of them, the EM-3 and EM-4, never progressed beyond the drawing board. The EM-1 and EM-2 emerged as serious contenders, and both shared a radical feature: the bullpup configuration, magazine and action behind the trigger, not in front of it. The result was a rifle with a full-length barrel, critical for accuracy, in a package 20% shorter than a conventional design. The EM-1 was designed by Stanley Thorpe. The EM-2 was designed by a man whose name most people have never heard, and whose story is one of the most remarkable in the history of firearms design. His name was Kazimierz Stefan Januszewski. He was born in Poland. Before the war, he'd served in a Polish anti-aircraft regiment and worked at the Radom factory and Huta Stalowa Wola, centers of Polish arms manufacturing. When Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland in 1939, Januszewski was captured and interned in a prisoner of war camp in Hungary. He escaped. The details are sparse, as they are for so much of his personal story, but what's known is that he fled Hungary carrying concealed weapons drawings. He crossed through Yugoslavia, then Italy, then France, moving through occupied and semi-occupied territory, a fugitive with technical knowledge that any intelligence service in Europe would have wanted. Somehow he reached Britain. He was put to work immediately. The Armament Design Department recognized what they had: a trained weapons engineer, experienced in manufacturing, desperate to contribute. He joined a team of Polish émigrés working under another Pole, Roman Korsak, on the EM-1 light machine gun. The war ground on. Januszewski worked. In 1947, he became a naturalized British citizen. That same year, his wife, from whom he'd been separated for 11 years, was finally able to join him in England. Imagine that reunion. 11 years of war, captivity, flight, exile, and now at last, a home, a country that would have him, work that mattered. In late 1947, the Infantry Personal Weapon Program launched, and Januszewski was selected to lead a team developing a new rifle, the EM-2. He drew on Korsak's work, on the German designs he'd studied, on everything he'd learned at Radom and in the workshops at Cheshunt. Assisting him was Sidney Hans, a young British engineer who would decades later design the original SA-80. In January 1950, Januszewski's rank of captain was confirmed, and he was gazetted into the Territorial Army Royal Artillery. In October of that year, he changed his name by deed poll, anglicizing it from Kazimierz Stefan Januszewski to Stefan Kenneth Janson. A new name, a new country, a new rifle. The rifle he built was extraordinary. The EM-2 looked like nothing the British Army had ever carried. Where the Lee Enfield was long and traditional, woodstock, iron sights, the familiar profile of a bolt-action rifle, the EM-2 was compact, angular, modern. Its bullpup layout put the magazine behind the pistol grip, the action tucked into what on a conventional rifle would have been the stock. The barrel ran the full length of the weapon, 24.5 inches, but the overall rifle measured just 35 inches. That was 9.5 inches shorter than the American M1 Garand, with the same barrel length. It was built around the .280 cartridge, and the two were designed to work as a system. The gas-operated mechanism, a long-stroke piston above the barrel, with a flap-locking system inspired by the German Gewehr 43, cycled smoothly. The recoil was manageable. On semi-automatic, a trained soldier could put rounds on target with a speed and accuracy that made everything else in NATO look antique. On fully automatic, the straight-line design between barrel and stock, no drop at the heel, no leverage to push the muzzle upward, kept the weapon remarkably stable. And then there was the sight, an optical sight built into the carrying handle, standard on every rifle. In 1951, no other nation in the world was proposing an optical sight as standard equipment on an infantry rifle. Iron sights were the norm. The EM-2's optic was simple, a conical reticle, but it transformed what an average soldier could do. You didn't need to be a marksman. You could see your target clearly at 300 yards and put rounds on it. At a public demonstration at the School of Infantry in Warminster in 1951, captured on film by British Pathé, the numbers told the story. The EM-2 fired 84 aimed shots per minute in semi-automatic mode. The American M1 Garand, the standard US infantry weapon considered the finest rifle of the Second World War, managed 43. The venerable Lee Enfield, the rifle the EM-2 was designed to replace, fired 27. There's a photograph from this period that firearms historians know well. Janson himself, standing on a range, firing the EM-2 with one hand, just one. The rifle extended at arm's length, muzzle barely moving, a demonstration of the weapon's balance, its lack of muzzle climb, the lightness of the .280's recoil. The rifle weighed just 3.49 kilograms, under 8 pounds. You could hold it in one hand and put rounds on target. On the 25th of April, 1951, Labour Defence Minister Emmanuel Shinwell stood in the House of Commons and made it official. The EM-2 was adopted as the new standard British service rifle, designated rifle, automatic, caliber .280, number 9, the Janson Rifle, the future of British infantry warfare. Belgium's Fabrique Nationale, one of the most respected arms manufacturers in the world, was enthusiastic. They'd been developing their own rifle, the early FL, around the .280 cartridge. Canada expressed support. The Commonwealth was aligning behind the British design and the British round. For the first time since the war, Britain was leading the Western world in small arms. A small number of EM-2s, the sources suggest approximately 50 were manufactured in total, were even sent overseas. British Army units in Malaya, fighting communist insurgents in the jungle during the emergency, took the new rifle on patrol. Real soldiers, real operations, real conditions. For a brief shining window in the spring and summer of 1951, it seemed Britain had done something remarkable. A Polish immigrant, working with a small team of engineers on a marshy island in North London, had built a rifle that was decades ahead of its time. The bullpup configuration, the intermediate cartridge, the integrated optic, controllable automatic fire. Every one of these features would eventually become standard on military rifles around the world, but not until the 1970s, the 1980s, some not until the 21st century. In 1951, the EM-2 had all of them in one weapon, ready for production. The factory at Enfield was preparing to tool up. The production lines that had built Lee Enfields and Bren guns and Sten guns were being reconfigured for the new rifle. The engineers who'd spent years developing the .280 and the EM-2 were for the first time seeing their work move from prototype to production, from drawing board to soldiers' hands. This was the peak, the absolute summit of everything the Royal Small Arms Factory and its associated design establishments had ever achieved. Not just building weapons to someone else's specification, designing the future, leading the world, and standing at that summit, nobody at Enfield could see the cliff they were about to walk off. Because in October 1951, a general election returned Winston Churchill to Downing Street, and the fate of the EM-2, the .280, and the future of British small arms passed from the hands of the engineers who'd built them into the hands of a politician who had already decided, before he'd even fired the weapon, that none of it mattered. The decisions that would destroy everything were already being made. The men at Enfield just didn't know it yet. The EM-2 had one enemy it couldn't outshoot, not the Soviets, not a competing weapon, not a flaw in its own design. The enemy was politics, specifically the politics of an alliance between a fading empire and the superpower that had replaced it. To understand what killed the EM-2, you have to understand the position Britain occupied in the early 1950s. The war was over, but the country was still paying for it. Rationing hadn't fully ended. The economy was fragile. The Soviet Union was expanding, and Western Europe's security depended on one thing above all: the American commitment to NATO. Without the United States, there was no Western alliance. Without the Western alliance, there was no defense against the Red Army. Every British politician, Labour and Conservative, understood this, and the Americans had their own ideas about rifles and ammunition. While the British had been developing the .280 intermediate cartridge, the United States Ordnance Department had been working on something very different. Their new round, designated the T-65, was derived from the old .30-06, the American standard since the First World War. Conservative elements within the Ordnance Department, led by Colonel Rene Studler, were unwilling to sacrifice range or stopping power. The T-65 was not an intermediate cartridge at all. It was a full power round, shorter than the .30-06, yes, but with 40% more muzzle energy than the British .280. The consequences of that difference were predictable to anyone who understood physics. A lighter rifle firing a more powerful round would be uncontrollable on fully automatic. The recoil would drive the muzzle upward. The whole point of the assault rifle concept, the ability to put aimed automatic fire on a target, would be lost. The British knew this. They said so, repeatedly, at every level, in every meeting, through every channel available to them. The Americans didn't care, or rather they cared about something else more. The T-65 was American. The production infrastructure was American. The Springfield Armory was developing American rifles to fire it. The Ordnance Department's position was straightforward. NATO would standardize, and NATO would standardize on American ammunition. They weren't interested in discussions about what was technically better. They accepted the principle of standardization, but only if their round was the one being standardized. In early 1950, the EM-2 and the FNFAL, both chambered in .280, were shipped to the United States for comparative testing at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, alongside the American T-25 rifle in the T-65 caliber. The trials ran from March to November and were conducted, by most accounts, with considerable fairness. The results, preserved in official U.S. Army reports, tell a story that should have settled the argument. The EM-2 gave the best performance in dust, the best in mud, the best in cold weather, the best in dry conditions, the best in automatic accuracy, and it didn't matter. The American position was fixed before the trials began. The results were acknowledged, filed, and quietly set aside. The U.S. Ordnance Department continued to insist the .280 was underpowered. The British continued to argue that the T-65 was too powerful for anything except a heavy, unwieldy battle rifle that no soldier could fire on automatic without losing control. Both sides were, in their own way, correct, but only one side was writing the checks. Through 1951, as Shinwell announced the adoption of the EM-2 and Belgium and Canada signaled their support for the .280, the American position hardened, and then came a moment that defined the entire crisis. Canada, caught between its British heritage and its American neighbor, announced that it would adopt the .280 round, but only if the United States did as well. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. The United States was never going to adopt the .280. Canada's statement wasn't support. It was a polite funeral announcement. The coalition behind the British cartridge was hollow. It would hold only as long as no one was forced to choose between London and Washington. And then, in October 1951, the Conservatives won the general election. Winston Churchill, 76 years old, the most famous man in the Western world, the lion of British defiance, returned to Downing Street for the second time. Churchill had already made his position clear. While in opposition, he'd stood in the House of Commons and publicly questioned the Labour government's decision to adopt the EM-2, asking why Britain would cut itself off from the weapons the Americans and Canadians were developing. His instinct was transatlantic unity above all. The American alliance was not something to be risked over a rifle caliber. It was existential. The engineers at Enfield and Cheshunt, the men who'd spent years developing the .280 and the EM-2, who had the test results, the ballistic data, the field reports from Malaya, watched the election results with a dread they couldn't quite articulate. They'd built something brilliant. Whether it survived would now depend on a man who'd already decided that brilliance wasn't the point. On a cold, rainy Saturday evening in November 1951, a small group of military officers arrived at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence in Buckinghamshire. They brought with them 2 rifles and a great deal of anxiety. The delegation included Brigadier J.A. Barlow, the Director of Small Arms Development, Brigadier Gordon, responsible for infantry equipment and training, Colonel Noel Kent Lemon, the project leader, representatives of the Small Arms School Corps, and Stefan Janson, the man who'd designed the EM-2, the man who'd escaped Hungary, crossed 4 countries, built a masterpiece in a workshop at Cheshunt. He was about to watch a 77-year-old politician decide whether it mattered. Churchill wanted to see both rifles, the EM-2 and the leading American competitor, the T-25, chambered in the powerful T-65 round. He'd been challenged by the Labour opposition to personally test the weapons, and he'd agreed. A range had been set up on the Chequers grounds. The weather was miserable, rain blowing sideways, a cold wind off the Chiltern Hills. Given Churchill's age and health, the officers decided to keep the shooting brief, restrict the firing to the bare essentials, as Brigadier Barlow later wrote in his report, in the hope that other points could be covered by conversation afterwards. They started with the EM-2. Churchill stood, raised the rifle, and fired 20 rounds at a target 100 yards away. He scored 9 hits. For a 77-year-old man standing in the rain with a weapon he'd never fired before, it was respectable. General Henry Pownall, Churchill's friend and personal advisor, fired from a bench and scored 20 out of 20. Then Quartermaster Sergeant Instructor Thwaites of the Small Arms School Corps demonstrated what the rifle could really do. 80 rounds in rapid semi-automatic fire. Then he switched to fully automatic and fired from the hip, hitting targets at 30 yards. Churchill himself had to go from the hip. He did, in the careful language of Barlow's report, reasonably well. Then they handed him the American T-25. Churchill fired 11 rounds, standing position same as before. The T-65 round punched back into his shoulder with each shot, the full-power cartridge delivering the recoil that the British engineers had warned about, the recoil that made the whole concept of a controllable automatic rifle impossible. Churchill stopped, put the rifle down. He did not wish to fire the damn thing anymore. Those words are recorded in Brigadier Barlow's official report, written on the 3rd of December 1951, copies of which reside in the United Kingdom's National Archives. The Prime Minister of Great Britain, the man who would decide the fate of the EM-2, had just experienced in his own hands exactly what the British engineers had been saying for years. The American round was too powerful. The American rifle was unpleasant to fire. The EM-2 was better. He knew it. Everybody in that rain-soaked garden knew it. The demonstration moved indoors. Over dinner, the EM-2's advocates made their case. Brigadier Gordon explained the tactical logic that in a future war against the numerically superior Soviet army, Britain's advantage would lie in giving every infantry soldier a controllable assault rifle capable of high rates of accurate fire. The .280 and the EM-2 were that weapon. Nothing else in the West came close. Churchill listened, and then he told them the truth, as he saw it. He was not, he said, arguing with the technical conclusions presented to him. He accepted that the EM-2 was a superior weapon. He understood the ballistic advantages of the .280. He appreciated what the engineers had achieved, but he was more concerned with what he called an Atlantic pool of weapons, a common supply chain that the Western Allies could draw from in time of war, standardization with the United States and Canada, interoperability, the infrastructure of an alliance. He would try, he said, to persuade the Americans of the .280 round. He would make the case. But if he could not, and the way he said it made clear he already knew he could not. He was not prepared to proceed on point 280 unilaterally. Not prepared to proceed unilaterally. 9 words, spoken over dinner at Checkers. The death sentence for the best assault rifle in the world, delivered by a man who'd just fired it and admitted it was better than the alternative. Stefan Janson was in that room. He heard those words. The engineer who'd escaped a prisoner of war camp, who'd carried weapons drawings across 4 countries, who'd spent years of his life designing a rifle that outperformed everything else in NATO, told that it didn't matter, that the politics of the Atlantic Alliance outweighed the physics of ballistics and the judgment of every weapons expert in Britain. What do you do with that? How do you go back to the workshop the next morning? Churchill traveled to Washington in January 1952 to meet President Truman. The agenda was vast. Communist China, American strategic bombers being stationed in Britain, the selection of a NATO naval commander for the North Atlantic. Somewhere on that list, below the existential questions of nuclear deterrence and Cold War containment, was the matter of rifle ammunition. Little progress was made. Both sides agreed to continue with their existing weapons for now. The meeting was diplomatic, cordial, the kind of gathering where nothing is decided because everything has already been decided elsewhere. For the EM-2, Washington was the end. Churchill had tested the American position and found it immovable. The United States would not adopt the .280, not because the round was inferior, the Aberdeen Proving Grounds results had settled that question, but because it wasn't American. The Ordnance Department had their round, their rifles, their production lines. They weren't going to retool for a foreign cartridge designed on a marshy island in North London. A final attempt was made. Britain, Belgium, and Canada formed what became known as the BBC Committee, a last-ditch effort to develop a 7mm cartridge that would satisfy everyone, which in practice meant satisfying the Americans. Over the next 2 years, they tested variant after variant, the optimum, the high velocity, the compromise, the second optimum, different case lengths, different powder charges, different bullet weights, each one submitted to Washington, each one rejected. By the end of 1953, the committee acknowledged what everyone had known from the start. The Americans would accept nothing less than 7.62 by 51 millimeters, their T-65 round, now formalized as the NATO standard. On the 1st of February 1954, it became official. The 7.62 by 51 millimeter was the standard rifle cartridge of the Western Alliance. The EM-2 was dead. It couldn't be adapted to the longer, more powerful 7.62 round, not without a fundamental redesign that would sacrifice everything that made it special. The compact bullpup layout, the controllable recoil, the balanced weight, all of it depended on the .280 cartridge. Change the cartridge and you change the rifle into something else entirely. Britain adopted instead a licensed version of the Belgian FN-FAL, designated the L1A1 self-loading rifle, or SLR. It was a fine weapon in many respects, reliable, accurate at range, robust. Soldiers who carried it in the decades that followed often spoke of it with genuine affection, but it was not what the engineers at Enfield had designed. It was not what they'd wanted. It was a Belgian rifle in an American caliber, imposed on the British Army by political compromise. And here was the detail that cut deepest. The L1A1 was issued to British troops in semi-automatic only. The full auto capability was deliberately removed, because the 7.62 NATO round, the round the Americans had insisted was necessary, the round they'd forced on the entire Western Alliance, was too powerful to control on fully automatic in a shoulder-fired rifle, exactly what the British had said all along. Churchill had hoped that by adopting the FAL, he'd achieve the standardization that justified the sacrifice. If Britain and the Commonwealth adopted the same weapon as the Americans, the Atlantic pool of weapons would be real. Shared rifles, shared ammunition, shared supply chains. The Americans adopted the M14 instead, their own design, their own production, no standardization, no shared supply chain, no Atlantic pool, the entire sacrifice, the EM-2, the .280, a decade of British engineering, had been for nothing. And Stefan Janson, he left the armament design establishment, left Britain, moved to the United States, the country that had killed his rifle, to work for Winchester on the American Salvo project. The project involved developing a double-barreled variant of the FN-FAL, the very weapon that had replaced his own. He retired in America. He died there in 1993 at the age of 87. The rifle he built, the rifle he could fire with one hand, became a collector's legend, a myth, a what-if. Approximately 50 were ever made. Most survive in museums. One sits behind glass in the Interpretation Center at Enfield Island Village, in the building where the machine shop used to be, in the housing estate where the factory used to be. Rifle, automatic, caliber, .280, number 9. Adopted 25th April 1951, dead before Christmas. What killed the Royal Small Arms Factory wasn't a single blow. The EM-2's cancellation didn't shutter the gates. What it did was something quieter and, in the long run, more destructive. It broke the factory's reason for existing. For over a century, Enfield had been more than a production line. It was a design center, the place where British small arms were conceived, developed, prototyped, tested and refined before being produced at scale. The Lee Enfield wasn't just manufactured at Enfield, it was born there. The Bren gun was adapted and perfected there. The factory's identity was inseparable from its capacity to innovate. After 1954, that capacity began to atrophy. The L1A1 was a production contract, a Belgian design, manufactured under license. The engineers at Enfield built it competently, as they built everything competently, but they hadn't designed it. The creative center had been hollowed out. In 1963, half the site was closed. The factory that had sprawled across 90 acres, that had employed thousands during 2 world wars, was shrinking. The Cold War demanded weapons, but the British government was buying more of them from abroad. The domestic design capability that had produced the EM-2 was quietly defunded, dispersed, diminished. Through the 1960s and 1970s, there were flickers of the old ambition. Enfield engineers designed the L64/65, another bullpup rifle, chambered in an experimental 4.85mm cartridge. Once again, it was technically impressive. Once again, NATO standardization killed it. This time, the alliance had settled on 5.56mm, and the British were forced to abandon their own caliber research for the second time in a generation. The echoes of 1951 were unmistakable. Different decade, different cartridge, same outcome. British engineers designed something innovative. NATO politics dictates something else. The engineers comply. The institutional memory of defeat compounds. From the ashes of the 4.85mm program came the SA-80, small arms for the 1980s. It was a bullpup, like the EM-2, and casual observers sometimes assumed a direct lineage. There was none. The SA-80 was mechanically based on the American Armalite AR-18, a conventional rifle turned inside out and stuffed into a bullpup shell. It shared the EM-2's configuration, but none of its engineering DNA. The SA-80 was the last weapon the Royal Small Arms Factory would ever produce. It was supposed to be a triumph, the most accurate and reliable assault rifle in the world, designed and built in Britain. Production began in 1985. The first rifles were issued that October. The problems started almost immediately. Development had been complicated by at least 3 staffing changes at RSAF. Early rifles produced at Enfield were of poor quality. The production tolerances required for the stamped steel components were tighter than those the factory's aging equipment could reliably achieve. When production transferred to Nottingham, quality improved, but the damage was done. By 1990, more than 24 distinct design flaws had been catalogued: corroded bolts, broken firing pins, faulty magazine release mechanisms that caused magazines to fall out when the weapon bumped against a soldier's body. The designers had built it for right-handed shooters only. Left-handed soldiers couldn't fire it without getting hit in the face by ejected brass. The plastic furniture melted on contact with insect repellent. The metal rusted easily. The Gulf War of 1991 was the SA-80's first trial by combat. British troops carried it into the desert alongside soldiers who still had the L1A1 SLR. The older soldiers, the ones who remembered the SLR, had no difficulty making comparisons. The SLR worked. The SA-80 didn't. Not reliably, not in sand, not in heat, not when it mattered. Soldiers gave it a nickname, the civil servant, because it didn't work and you couldn't fire it. The bitter irony hung over the whole affair like smoke. If the EM-2 had been adopted in 1951, British soldiers would have had over 30 years with a controllable, accurate, reliable assault rifle, and critically, the institutional knowledge and design continuity at Enfield to create a proper successor when the time came. Instead, the creative chain had been broken. The engineers who understood how to design a bullpup from first principles were gone. What remained was an attempt to graft an American mechanism into a British layout, built in a factory that was already dying. In 1984, the Royal Small Arms Factory was privatized, along with several other Royal Ordnance factories, to form Royal Ordnance plc. It was purchased by British Aerospace. On the 12th of August 1987, closure was announced. The factory closed in 1988. The machinery, the lathes and milling machines and assembly fixtures, some of them descendants of the American equipment purchased in 1856, was auctioned off in November, sold to the highest bidder, scattered. The pattern room, the master collection of every weapon ever made at RSAF Enfield, a physical archive of 172 years of British small arms history, was moved to Nottingham. When Nottingham closed, it moved again to the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds. It sits there still, a collection in a museum separated from the place that gave it meaning. SA-80 production continued at Nottingham until 1994. Over 350,000 were built. Not one was exported. No other country bought the rifle. The weapon that was supposed to be world-beating couldn't find a single foreign customer. And then, the final indignity. In the late 1990s, the British government awarded a contract to Heckler & Koch, a German company, to fix the SA-80, to redesign the bolt, the extractor, the cocking handle, the hammer assembly. To do the work that British engineers should have been able to do but no longer could because the factory where they'd learned their craft was a construction site and the design tradition that had produced the EM-2 had been dead for 40 years. The upgraded L-85A2 was, by most accounts, a decent rifle. Reliable enough, accurate, adequate. Soldiers stopped calling it the civil servant, but the symbolism was inescapable. The last British-designed service rifle had to be sent to Germany to be made functional. Today, the site of the Royal Small Arms Factory is Enfield Island Village. If you drive up from London, you take the A1055 to Mollison Avenue, past the industrial estates of Brimsdown, past the kind of light industrial landscape, warehouses, logistics depots, trade counters that has replaced manufacturing across most of England. You cross a bridge over the Lee Navigation and you're on the island. The houses are neat, detached and semi-detached, red brick mostly, built between 1997 and 2003 on the brownfield site. There's a central parkland with an ornamental canal, children on scooters, cars in driveways, the kind of development that estate agents describe as a village community. The machine shop stands at the center. You can walk past it and barely notice it. It's been integrated into the development so smoothly that it reads as part of the estate rather than a remnant of something older. But look closer. The Italianate facade, the cast iron columns through the windows, the clock tower, the canal basin still connected to the Lee Navigation, where barges loaded with iron and coal and finished rifles once made the trip to the Thames. Inside, the interpretation center occupies a small portion of the building, glass cases, a few rifles, photographs, workers in flat caps and heavy aprons, the machine shop floor crowded with belt-driven machinery, a line of Lee Enfields standing in racks like sentries. There are information panels explaining the factory's history, a timeline on the wall, an EM-2 behind glass, the optical sight still clear, the green furniture faded, the metalwork dark with age, a small card, rifle, automatic, caliber .280, number 9. The museum is open by appointment. A handful of former apprentices, members of the RSAF Apprentices Association, volunteer their time to maintain the collection and tell the stories. They're getting older, the last generation of men who worked in the factory, who remember the sound of the machines and the smell of cutting oil and the particular institutional pride of a place that had been making things that mattered since before their grandfathers were born. Walk outside. Follow the towpath south along the navigation. On your left, the river. On your right, what used to be the testing grounds. Marshland stretching toward the old gunpowder mills at Waltham Abbey. It's part of the Lee Valley Park now. Herons, fishermen, narrowboats moored along the bank. The government row cottages are still there. 81 of them, listed Grade 2, a terrace of modest homes with a direct line of sight to where the factory gates once stood. The occupants have changed. In 1881, they were stokers and pattern keepers and policemen. Now they're commuters. The cottages are worth more than the men who built them could have imagined. Down the road, the shell of the Rifles pub sits behind a fence, fire damaged, boarded up. The last unreconstructed building on the island, the one structure that still looks unmistakably like something that belonged to what was here before. Everything else is tidy, orderly, quiet. The kind of quiet that descends on a place when its purpose has been removed and something else, something gentler, smaller, more domestic, has been layered on top. You can walk the perimeter of the island in an hour, past Ordnance Road, past Sten Close, past Bren Court, street names that mean nothing to the children who live on them, ghost names, a vocabulary from a world that has been demolished and paved over and sold off in two-bedroom increments. The story of the EM-2 and the Royal Small Arms Factory is not, in the end, a story about a rifle. It's a story about what happens when the people who know how to build things are overruled by the people who decide what gets built. The engineers at Enfield and Cheshunt spent years developing the .280 cartridge and the EM-2. They tested them, they proved them, they took them to Aberdeen and showed the Americans what they could do. And the official results confirmed what they already knew. They were ahead, further ahead than Britain had been in small arms design, since the invention of the Lee Enfield half a century earlier, and it didn't save them. Churchill wasn't a villain. He was a politician making a political calculation, and the calculation wasn't unreasonable. The Atlantic Alliance was the cornerstone of European security. The United States was the senior partner, alienating Washington over a rifle caliber. Even a rifle caliber the British knew was right seemed like a poor trade for a nation that depended on American nuclear protection. Perhaps he was right to prioritize the alliance. Perhaps in the larger calculus of the Cold War, it was the only responsible choice. The argument can be made. But the cost was real, and it was paid by people who had no say in the decision. By Stefan Janson, who left England for a country that had rejected his work. By the engineers who were forced to retool for a weapon they hadn't designed, firing a cartridge they knew was wrong. By the apprentices who would never learn the skills that had made Enfield what it was. By the soldiers who, decades later, carried a broken SA-80 into the desert because the design tradition that could have given them something better had been severed at the root. And by the factory itself. The Royal Small Arms Factory survived the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, 2 World Wars, the threat of closure in 1831, in 1963, in every peacetime budget cycle that asked whether a government arms factory was still necessary. 172 years. It survived everything, except a political decision that said what it produced didn't matter as much as who it kept happy. The final vindication came too late to help anyone. Within a decade of the 7.62 NATO round being standardized, the Americans abandoned it. The M14, the rifle they'd insisted upon, the rifle that justified the entire sacrifice, was replaced by the M16, firing 5.56 by 45 millimeters, a round that was smaller than the .280 the British had proposed, lighter, less powerful, designed for exactly the kind of controllable automatic fire that the .280 had been created to deliver. NATO eventually followed. By the 1970s, the alliance was standardizing on 5.56 millimeters. The full-power 7.62 round remained in use for machine guns and designated marksman rifles, but as a standard infantry cartridge, it was finished. The intermediate concept had won, the same concept the British had championed in 1947. The British were right about the cartridge, right about the rifle concept, right about the future of infantry warfare. History confirmed every technical argument they made. It just confirmed it 30 years too late, in a factory that no longer existed, for engineers who had already scattered to the wind. There's a quiet cruelty in being proven right after the decision can no longer be changed. It doesn't feel like vindication. It feels like a eulogy. The factory is gone. The machines are gone. The men who built the EM-2 are gone. Stefan Janson died in America in 1993. Roman Korsak before him. Sidney Hans went on to design the SA-80 and probably wished he hadn't. The pattern room sits in Leeds. The apprenticeship program is a memory. Britain no longer designs its own service rifles. When the SA-80 is finally retired, which is expected by 2030, its replacement will almost certainly be a foreign design. American, German, Belgian, it doesn't matter. It won't be British. That capability is gone. What remains is the machine shop at Enfield Island Village. Red and yellow brick, cast iron columns, the clock tower, a small museum you can visit if you make an appointment. And behind the glass, gathering dust, the rifle that was adopted on the 25th of April, 1951, and killed by the end of the year. The optical sight is still clear. The green furniture is faded. The mechanism is locked open, the weapon deactivated, made safe, as the catalogue says. If you stand in that building on a quiet morning, before the business park fills up and the school run starts on the streets outside, you can almost feel it, the weight of what was here, not just the factory, the knowledge, the skill, the institutional memory of 172 years of making things that worked when lives depended on them. All of it gone, not with a single dramatic closure, but with a long, slow fade that began the moment a politician decided that what the engineers had built mattered less than what the Americans wanted. The silence on that island isn't peaceful, it's the silence of a place that was built for noise, for the stamp of presses and the hiss of steam and the crack of proof-fired rifles echoing across the marshes. The silence means it's over, and the question nobody answered in 1952 still hangs in the air, quiet and unresolved. What happens to a country when the people who know how to build things are told that building things isn't the point?